The people, my people are so smart. And you know what else they say about my people? The polls. They say, I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
Voter suppression has taken many forms.
People have been denied the right to vote for, well, now 80 years.
First, they used the poll tax to keep black folks from voting. Then, it was the literacy test, racial terrorism, and violence.
I don't want everybody to vote.
New day, same old dirty tricks.
There are those in power who are doing their darndest to discourage people from voting.
Calls for investigations after claims of voter suppression.
President Trump sabotaging efforts to vote by mail.
If your vote didn't matter, they wouldn't try so hard to take it from you. Vote early. Vote like your life depends on it. I'm exercising my right to vote, and you should too. Not because I want you to, but because he doesn't. Vote, damn it! Vote!
Welcome back, global citizens. I am Pharaoh, and he, my co-host, is The Scribe, and this is our podcast. Stay woke. Thank you so much for rocking out with us. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube page, please hit the subscribe button there, if you please. Today's segment is about the soul of the nation. In 9 days, we're going to vote for the 46th president. I'm going to need you, my global citizens, to be aware and to have resolution on who you're going to choose. So we thought it was vitally important for us to share with you some background about voting, specifically my African Americans, how voting came about, why it's important, and what is this issue with Republicans and Democrats. We hear a lot of chatter around, the internet, social media about Republicans. Talk to me, Scribe. How are people feeling about this voting thing that's coming up in these next 9 days?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of anxiety, I think, from everyone, like we literally are all anxious. We don't know what's going to happen. But like you said, particularly our people, the Black people, there's this whole movement. It's like a caucus for the Black vote. And we keep hearing this a lot. The Black vote. We need to get the Black vote. And people are out in all the, predominantly Black states like North Carolina and the South. And everyone's like trying to get this Black vote. But I want us to specifically talk about us as a people, Black people,
Sure.
How this all came about, what happened after slavery and all the amendments that happened to lead us to today, and why it's so important for us to vote, but also the value of the vote, why is it deemed so valuable, And so, I just really wanted us to just get into like the gist of like, the importance of voting, because I feel like everybody should go out and vote, regardless of who you want to vote for. Just go out there and, I can't say it enough. It's important that you cast your vote, But B, I just wanted us to like talk about this whole Democratic versus Republican debate,
Yeah, I think there's some misnomers about the Black people always voting democratically, right? I think we do have a history, though, of being connected with the Republican Party. And then there was a switch at some point in time where we started to value more of the Democratic political platform or position itself. But I still want to make all our global citizens aware that during this pandemic, please stay safe. That involves you wearing your mask.
Absolutely. Everybody go out there.
Also, please sanitize your hands.
Especially if you're going to go out there and vote in person.
Social distance.
Absolutely.
And exercise your right to vote. Absolutely. So let's jump in, Scribe. We might as well get started, though. I don't want to hold us up too long, though, because I think the global citizens are anxious, right, to understand exactly what this Republican Democratic thing is in reference to African-American people, what that voting looked like. So I'm ready. Let's get it.
So let's first talk about like the history, right? So
Sure.
If you can share some information with us. So when exactly after slavery was abolished did Black people start voting?
So I think it's important to start with Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
Right? Abraham Lincoln, first was our first president from 1861 to about 65. Leading up until that time, though, the North and the South, or the Union and the Confederate, were always starting to draw apart because they had differences on how to progress the country. The Republicans at that time were interested in terms of their platform on ensuring social justice through expanding the federal powers of the Republican Party. That means that the federal government has more control over the laws and the rules. And the Confederate, or the South primarily, was more concerned with independence, states having their local rights. And this is really important when we get along further in the segment of our podcast, because enacting federal laws doesn't necessarily mean they play out the same way in the states, if that makes sense.
Okay, that makes sense.
So Abraham Lincoln, I don't know if people know this, but Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, right? Okay. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, but he was president only for one term. He got reelected, but as soon as he got reelected, he actually was assassinated, as all of us know, in 1865. After that, his vice president, who was actually a Democrat for the South. So this is one, and please fact check me, guys, if I'm wrong, but this is one crazy kind of ticket, having a Republican president and a Democratic, vice president. But I think the idea was to blend a national unity between the Union and the Confederate areas of the United States. Go ahead.
So what you're saying is, like, initially there wasn't that much of a separation between the two parties. That's why you could have a president who was a Republican and a VP who was a Democrat?
No, they definitely had differences of opinion, and there definitely was a separation of those of both political parties. But I think the idea behind Lincoln having Andrew Johnson as his running mate was to unite the Union and to unite the Confederate after we ended the Civil War. So the idea of, like, once we beat them or defeated the Confederate Army in the Civil War, because so maybe I should start a little further back. So initially it was called the Democratic Republican Party. And that was by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, the founders of our Constitution. They generally had that built together. Our seventh president, Andrew Jackson, is the one that really initiated the Democratic Party separately from the Republic, or whatever was left over was kind of called the Republican Party. It wasn't necessarily a built party, but it was the remaining aspects of it. So the Republican Party is actually the oldest voter-based political party in the world and the oldest in the U.S. And again, the Democratic Party was started in 1828.
Okay, so from my understanding, the people at the time that were allowed to vote were predominantly, or actually only, white males, right? And then at some point, the laws kind of like changed. And so now they've included. So at what point did we start including Black people? Because I understand that it's only later when women actually allowed to vote. But Sure. It seems like Black men were allowed to vote before any other demographic, like even before white women could vote. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of history, I think, that is involved with prior to African Americans having the right to vote. So I think a great place to start is after the Civil War. Once the Emancipation Proclamation was actually decreed, Abraham Lincoln, again, I said he was assassinated. I think from the history I was reading that the VP, who was out of Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, he was actually the first president to ever be impeached. But I think he was involved in this assassination of Lincoln as his VP. I think that he was born out of Tennessee, which is the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. Yeah, I think that he and other government officials plotted and planned against Abraham Lincoln and murdered him, because right after he murdered him, He had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but it really didn't abolish slavery per se. And then the Congress, which was made up of Republicans. So Republicans during this time were all for really having the nation follow kind of a federal rule. But the South was still looking at them being independent states and having local governments be able to decide the laws and the rules surrounding how they govern their areas. So that was always and will always be a clash between the federal government and the local states. But protective rights for African Americans weren't really included in all of what the Republicans were saying federally. They were talking the great game for us in terms of justice for all through the expansion of federal powers, but they really were speaking more so to only whites. And after that, the Congress then, at least the Republican Congress, really began to fight earlier on for African American rights. And hence, after the Emancipation Proclamation, we have an era which we call Reconstruction, which people should be familiar with. But it's the era when we started to rebuild our nation with a combined Union and a Confederate army. Not army, but Confederate states now in one United States itself. But not everything was equal. And specifically, after 1865, 4 million blacks were freed. So now that they were freed and running in the states, what was the nation to do with them, right? In terms of rights, you freed them, but they still didn't have the same amount of rights. And hence, I think these amendments or reconstructions but the idea of Reconstruction was put into play. And this when we have the first, the 13th Amendment. Once the 13th Amendment was ratified, which abolished all slavery, it kind of helped support the Emancipation Proclamation that was signed by Abraham Lincoln.
Okay, so let's talk about these. I think there are three crucial amendments, at least from the research that I've done, being, like, as you mentioned, the 13th Amendment, which was the abolition of slavery. And then, of course, the 14th Amendment, which, just clarifies the rights of, citizenship and who's a citizen and, subsequently who can vote. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment, which is, the right to vote.
It only gave everyone the right to vote. Everyone meaning it included black men, but still didn't include women. So right. White men, black men, I think white women were allowed to vote. But even in that time, giving that right to vote for African Americans in the South was completely dangerous. And the reason is that once you freed, specifically, you have to understand where our country was at that point. Mm-hmm. So the Union or the North or the northern states really focused on manufacturing, the transcontinental trains that were built, steel, and factory workers. So it wasn't really a lot of agriculture. So they didn't need people to pick cotton as much, and there weren't many farms. But in the South, that was the South economic drive. They had, cotton was one of their major, agricultural commodities that they needed work for. And initially, before, the slaves were freed, there was their main labor force. But once you freed these slaves, then a lot of the South was wondering how we're going to keep our economy up when we don't have this enslaved labor. But the Union felt really, and I think, I want to clarify for our global citizens that, the Republicans at that time weren't all, they were definitely trying to support, from what I've read, the freedom and the socialization of African Americans, but it was definitely economically driven. They knew that further voting in the future, as we begin to expand further west, from the east to the west and occupied more land, the Union knew that if they could get the states to have free slaves, that would help in terms of their votes. And then the South knew that if they could enslave most of the free blacks through other laws and rules, that could keep their economy up. So, that fight ensued prior to the Civil War. So tensions were leading up into the Civil War actually taking place they were already having problems with the Union and the Confederate South because they were expanding America, and they were at a crossroads on how to expand America. And these tensions about slavery really kind of came to a head, if you want, sense, with one of these laws or acts called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that was in 1854, which also happens to be the time when the Republican Party was actually founded, the true Republican Party. And their initial founding was an extension of a coalition opposing any slavery as the country began to move further west. So they felt that Nebraska Act felt that by sovereignty, meaning that if I get this land, I have full authority on how I conduct it, meaning I could reinstitute slavery. And the Union was not having it, which ended up being one of the impetus leading up into the Civil War in 1865.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So,
I'm sorry, brother. Let me backtrack. Okay. The Civil War broke out in 1861 and lasted into 1865. But leading up until the breakout of 1861 was the tensions between the Union and the Confederate South on how to expand America, and then subsequently how to deal with slavery.
So it seems like that all happened and took place during Lincoln's term, right? 1861 to 1865. But what I'm hearing, which I think is also like...
Well, I think they took his ass out later on because they felt like, this is what you're going to do for I think he got elected in 61, right? He didn't free the slaves immediately. I think 2 or 3 years after he was elected in 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And I think it went into effect after the Civil War. But that was one of the things that led them to say, okay, now you're going to free the slave that we use as our source of economy. It's on. At least the Confederate was like, it's on. You've now freed our primary source, our resource for our labor here. And you said 4 million free blacks. Now, so I think they killed him. And I think that Andrew Johnson was part of that assassination plot, because after that, Congress was trying to ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. He actually vetoed it, and they actually had to veto him in order to put that 13th Amendment into play. So, yeah, he was shady as fuck.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it sounds like they were all shady as fuck, in terms of like, I feel like, which is also, I feel this is something which is similar in a sense to what's happening today, which is like people want the black vote if it's going to help their numbers. And so at that point, it was like it made sense to add an extra 4 million people that could potentially help me win this election. And which is very similar to today, you know what I mean? I might not necessarily agree or be for their liberation, but if I can get them or persuade them in a sense by establishing certain policies and programs that they might identify with, I might just get a couple of votes. Which could obscure the direction.
So I wouldn't necessarily say that the reasoning behind Abraham Lincoln really wanting to, I'm sure there were some morality issues in there, but it's more so the main control, the Union wanted the main control of the federal expansion part of it. Right. That we knew that if we freed these 4 million blacks, they had the right to vote, that we probably can maintain control of the Union itself. And the Confederate states weren't having that shit. They were more so for local state rule and authority and less big government. And so initially, all the Republicans put laws and rules into place that benefited African Americans during that time. So of course, we leaned more Republican when we had our actual right to vote. So Reconstruction had 3 major amendments associated with it. That was the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which established citizenship and naturalization, and then the 15th Amendment, which gave the right for everyone to vote. That was an actual citizen. But that also was the impetus to start a lot of what I consider to be systemic racism. But because that these laws were now federally mandated, the South started to put these other local laws and rules into play. So here is where I want our global citizens to be really keen, that you can have Republicans that say they're on our side and pass federal laws, but the local states are the one to put those laws into play. Your governors, your attorney generals, your litigators that you vote for locally actually exercise the law. So if you want to blame the federal government, really look at who we're putting in place locally in our states to exercise those laws. So I'm not trying to, have Biden's back, but that crime bill of 1994, let me be very clear that many blacks supported that 1994 crime bill because crack cocaine was out of control in the 80s. Now, that was a federal mandate that was approved, but the local states put that into play, and it disproportionately affected African-American men. A lot of us were put into jail, but now we associate that with Biden voting for that. We skipped all the way over the fact that the states put those federal laws into play, the 3 strikes law, and all those come out of the states coming up with those ideas of how to enact federal law.
Which I feel like, it's a misconception that a lot of people have, when policy is being debated and what it actually manifests when it's actually put in place, when you actually start seeing people, leaving the community and you have your brother, your sister, your nephew, whomever go to jail, the impact is completely different to theoretically theorizing the whole thing and be like, oh yeah, we just need to put more criminals in jail that are doing wrong in the neighborhoods. And the practicality of what actually happens when, the policy is enacted. But just going back to history a little bit, because I need more clarity. So I'm, this 19th century Black person, and now I'm voting Republican, right? And that's who I feel like has my best interests at heart. So where in history did we sway towards, becoming more Democrat, so to speak?
So I think Abraham Lincoln was our 16th president. He was a Republican. Andrew Johnson was our 17th president. He was, so I'm going after the Civil War. So let's start it after 1865, which is important because that is when the slaves were freed and we started to integrate into everyday society. So hence the laws and rules that weren't in play then are now in play, actually. So Ulysses S. Grant was our 18th president. And he also was a Republican. So the Republicans during that time period really championed the expansion of the federal government and federal powers, but they wanted to do it through social justice. So they may in name have said they were really trying to free the Blacks and help the African Americans out and put laws into place. But the law didn't go far enough. It didn't have enough teeth in order for the states to have to follow the rules. So up until, I would say, 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes, he was our 19th president. So back and forth between Abraham Lincoln and Rutherford B. Hayes, there were multiple Republican presidents that championed African-American causes. But when it got to Rutherford B. Hayes, one of the things that he did as president, which I believe effectively ended Reconstruction or the rebuilding of our country with now these 4 million free Blacks, is that he allowed, again, at this point, when he allowed the 15th Amendment to pass or okayed it, he allowed the states to go ahead and decide how to have independent, what they call sovereignty, or gave them sovereignty over deciding how to enact the laws. So from that, you start to see the rise of what we call Black codes, right? And Black codes were now ways that the states were able to control the African-American population. They decided when, where, how African-Americans could get jobs and how much their compensation was. And for a while, and what he didn't do, he didn't send any federal forces in to enforce the amendments that they had passed to the Constitution that allowed the rights for African Americans. So you started to see disproportionately this segregation, this legalized segregation of African Americans, this separate but equal was the idea, but it was separate but legal, and it really didn't help any African Americans at that time. So although we had the right to vote, and even in that time, like we had more representatives on, more Southern representatives in Congress. I think 22 African American men were elected to Congress, and 2 of them were in the Senate. But also what went along with that was the rise of these black codes, vagrancy laws, which said that any blacks that didn't have jobs were then incarcerated. So this, I think, also began mass incarceration. Then they had convict leasing, where they leased out the convicts that were in jail for not having jobs back to the plantation owners. So this recreated this cycle of enslavement, and to me was the impetus for the beginning of systemic racism.
So Rutherford v. Hayes, he was a Democrat?
He was a Republican. I'm sorry. He was a Democrat. He was a Democrat.
Okay. So now Rutherford can you give me an example of a black code?
So one of the black codes, so one of the black codes was that the slaves could only work so they would say that if slaves wanted to get a job, you would have to go back to the plantation in which you worked on initially. And if you had if you didn't have a job and you went to jail, whatever they sentenced you to, what they did, they end up giving you longer sentences. This is where the disparity in sentencing also started. They started giving African Americans who violated the black codes and vagrancy laws longer sentences. So they end up going back working on those plantations, and most of the time dying on it because they couldn't finish their sentences out.
So essentially what you're saying is that they figured a way out to quote unquote free slaves, but not actually free them,
Free them, but actually, well, I know the North, had an idea that putting these laws into place, but not allowing federal troops to follow through and enforce it in the states effectively allow slavery to continue.
Okay.
Right.
Wow.
And so that's why I want to distinguish when you can have federal laws, but if you don't have localized, or the federal laws don't have enough teeth in them, where they force the local states to follow through with making sure or assuring that the law is distributed equally amongst the people, that you will have these disparities. And African Americans were at the tail end of receiving a lot of these black codes. The Ku Klux Klan arose then. They were using these tactics to intimidate blacks who now have the right to vote. It can change the course of the laws, right? So really, the voting privilege and the voting right of the 15th Amendment really changed the course of our interaction in this country. But it also was the rise of a lot of violence against African Americans, primarily starting from the South.
Got it. Okay. So, I'm getting a clearer picture of the history.
I think I stand corrected. I think Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican. So let me take that. So him, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant were all Republicans that initially enacted federal law to help African Americans, really re-socialize after slavery, after we were freed. But that was only on the federal level, and they didn't really want to push too many of the seceding states, the southern states, too much. And some of the so-called Republicans were Southern sympathizers, but they were only Republicans in name, but really they were Democrats at that time, because Democrats ruled the South. So this is where some of the current Republicans, like Candace Owen, is giving a lot of the African Americans now shit, because they're like, how can you follow these Democrats when earlier on it was Republicans that really had our back, right? In a sense, they did, but it was really on the federal level, but they never forced the state and local governments to enact these laws. So blacks still suffered. And it seemed as though that Republicans were helping us out because they wanted the vote.
Well, I mean, it also sounds like the Republican Party as it stands back then is not the same as the party today. And so I think both parties have kind of like moved and changed with the times in order to better accommodate, you know, whatever agenda that they're trying to push. But, you know, so Roosevelt and Lincoln and all these other.
Rutherford B. Hayes. Yeah, I would say he was the guy that sold us out. He was the last Republican president that I believe in 1877 that sold the African Americans out. You know, although he helped finalize some of the amendment, like the last amendment, but he didn't force. And this is where I believe, was sympathizing with some of the, you know, the congressmen from the South and allowed them to develop their own laws. And then he also never sent in any federal help to enforce and make sure African Americans were safe based upon these new laws. So a lot of the black codes came out, vagrancy laws, and then Jim Crow.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense between, you know, the black codes, the vagrancy laws, you know, Jim Crow. Why would you even continue to vote for a political party that is clearly not, you know, for you and your liberation? And so how do we actually transition from that to where we are today? Because I feel
a lot of blacks, African Americans, then when they got the right to vote, were Republican. They were. Yeah. So it was only, and I believe the start of the transition, the first Democrat that I feel that recently had this kind of socialist or this social understanding in terms of reform for African Americans was FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1936, right? Because this is right after the Depression. So I would say from 1860 to 1936 is where somewhere in between there, the party switched. I would say primarily, I would believe after 1877, but after that, you know, a lot of the black codes, the Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan, from that time period after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were ratified, these organizations were terrorizing African Americans for many, many years in terms of our political stance. And in 1936, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he really had what he called the New Deal. He instituted this New Deal. And this New Deal, this is really after the Depression, is when the welfare programs came up, you know, pensions, things came up, small businesses. He was really helping the common person, which was a change from the Democrats earlier on, which were looking to oppress and suppress African Americans at that time. So that nuance, I believe, from there really sparked a lot of the African Americans to become Democrat.
Okay, makes sense. I mean, if you're creating policy and programs to help the average and struggling person, which obviously are predominantly people of color,
sure.
So that is would be enticing for someone in that position. And so from 1936 with FDR, that's when the shift started to happen.
Yeah, this is right after the Depression. So from 1917 and 20, I think the World War I was around that time, around 1919 to 1921, somewhere around there. But Black African Americans, I would say, like more 350,000 actually went to war, right? Okay. And found out over in, Europe, they were fighting for freedom and for free rights, and they would come back here to the United States, and there was this segregation and these race, black codes and the Ku Klux Klan. They were like, what the fuck is going on in our own country? We can't have our freedom. So when they came back, they were subjected to these, to these movements of white supremacy that were trying to, push back Reconstruction, right, which is supposed to help all the 4 million blacks that were freed. So our local government Well, really, this is where when people say there's no systemic racism, we need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and work a little harder. Yeah, that's true. We should. Everyone should. But if it's built into the system, into our current laws that prohibit African Americans from progressing, no matter how much hard work we have, it's institutionalized slavery, right? It's in the stuff. It may not be as overt, but it's in everything we do in terms of our laws. So when our vote actually really, really matters, and going forward. So go ahead, Scribe.
Okay. Yeah. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm just thinking from it, like, just from a young person's perspective, because I think I get a lot of the history, but there's a gap for me that maybe you can help me fill in, which is, I think, like, a lot of young people like struggle to like conceptualize because, of a lack of like interest in history, I guess. But I think a lot of what we learn and are interested in when it comes to history is like everything up from the civil rights movement leading up to today. But so there's a gap for me, at least, between, the early 20th century leading up to like the 1960s, in terms of like what was happening in the country, like between that time.
So we knew, one, we were at World War One. The Great Depression was in the 1930s. We were going through the shits here in the U.S. And at the same time, we were dealing with racial unrest for Blacks that had now been freed and were fighting for their rights in these laws. So a lot of the politicians, at least democratically after FDR, were really, were Democrats that were really focusing on developing the African-American freedom and ending our suffrage here. So we had a lot going on in the country. World War One, then World War II, then we were in the Vietnam War. So all those wars took place at the same time that we were trying to build and ground America and find a place for the African Americans to have, who have been enslaved, who are now free, to find how do they integrate into society. And hence you see movements like, really after FDR, is really, the civil rights movement started to take place. They started to really fight for our own rights. And hence we had, Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was one of the key presidents who signed the Civil Rights Act into law, the Voting Rights Act into law. He established Medicare. He did Head Start. He protected voting. So Lyndon Baines Johnson was another Democrat at that time that really, I'm not saying Dr. Martin Luther King was a Democrat at all, but I believed he was really for the advancement of African Americans. So if whoever was in power, he really wanted to work a way out that could help solidify the rights. And Lyndon Baines Johnson was one of those presidents, I believe, as a Democrat, that really stood up for the rights of African Americans during the 1960s and during our movements then. Okay. But you also have opposing factors, right? So I think because the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1900s are, right after, right after we were free, they emerged. And for years, the Klan had almost 4 million members from the 1920s all up into into the Depression. So I would say for maybe 10 or 15 or 16 years, the Klan was running rampant, killing Blacks all over the country. We have these mass murders and mass, outbreaks of riots, racial riots during that time, and only during the Depression kind of decimated the Ku Klux Klan at that point in time, because again, I said they had like 4 million members across the country. So today, now they're about 6,000 to 10,000, I think, total in the country. But earlier on, they were, this is why Candace Owens talks about a lot. There's no more Klan members, not as much, but you don't really need Klan members to enforce policy when it's integrated into the system already.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a surgence of like, especially now we're seeing it in a lot of, pop culture and in television, trying to like really retell and teach us about these things that happened in those times with what happened in Tulsa, and like, so it seems like there was a lot of progression that Black people were heading towards that was kind of suppressed and stopped by those movements, which kind of like justifies why potentially why Black people are where they're at today, because it seems like throughout history, whenever we try to advance towards, something greater than, slavery, there was some sort of movement or organization that tried to suppress that and like, erase the advancements of Black people. And so that's, I think for me, it sounds like that's where the allegiance lies with Democrats today. You know what I mean? Because
Right. White people can say, other Republicans say that we're looking for a handout. I think if you bring 4 million enslaved people from another country to a whole nother country, you enslave them for hundreds of years, then you set them free and you tell them to make it on your own. Right. There has to be some onus on whoever brought me over to make sure I have equal opportunity. It's not a handout. Reparations are ways to pay back what they stole, what they took from us. I don't think anyone's looking for a handout. I think the idea is to have government subsidize what they've, suppressed in the ability of African Americans to create any kind of generational wealth.
Yeah, and it sounds to me like there are so many laws and policies that were put into place even after the abolition of slavery. The Jim Crow laws, the vagrancy laws, like Black codes.
All those are the start of systemic racism, and people not to acknowledge that it's embedded in society. Some of the same Confederate soldiers that were in the South, once we defeated the South and we combined the Union and the Confederate, those same people became the police officers, became the judges, so when Blacks went to court or went to jail, of course they were still unfairly treated by people who enslaved them earlier on. It's ridiculous not to think so. So this is where we needed the federal protection, which didn't come into play. And this is why I don't necessarily adhere too much to Republicans, because that was only in title and name. Nothing really had them enforced on the localized level. So I want us to get our mindsets out of just thinking that the presidency is going to rescue us. We need to be voting for our governors, our attorney generals in our local states, and we need a national plan. So I don't care what they say about Ice Cube shit, but his contract with Black Americans is finally one, I think, start to have whoever's in power, and people miss this point, which I think is vitally crucial. He says, I showed my plan to Democrats and to Republicans. Now, I read his plan. It's about a 13-point plan that covers some of the same basic rights that we are currently protesting and fighting for, but in an organized fashion. So the Color of Change, Black Lives Matter, and all the other independent Black groups that are trying to mobilize to help Black Americans receive the rights we need. I need all you guys to coalesce, to make a coalition, to collaborate together and have one agenda that you force whoever's in office. God damn it, I'm going to change my affiliation. I'm a Democrat, and I voted Democrat this time, but I believe I'm going to become independent. I know you don't want me to bring it up, but I am. I think I'm going to become independent.
Okay, so let's talk about this. Let's talk about this since you brought it up and you wanted to go here, okay? Let's talk about Ice Cube and what he's trying to do, which I think is which I think is a brilliant idea. And of course, I agree with you 100%. We need to have some sort of coalition and have some sort of Black agenda that we can present, and that we can all kind of be like, at least have some sort of agreement on. But my only issue with what Ice Cube is doing is that his timing is off, completely off, right? In the sense that we have a sitting president who's known to not even believe in science. He lies all the fucking time. There's no doubt that he's racist, right? Like his character, his morality, him as a person is questionable. I don't care who you are.
Sure.
But so why would you then, at this very crucial moment, try to present or have any sort of like collaborative talks? Or I'm for it, like after election, you know, hypothetically, God, no willing, I hope he doesn't win. But if he does, have that conversation. But I just feel like the time is like completely off. And this is not the time to be talking to the Republican Party or Trump at this moment about what Black people want or what we're heading towards or what we would like, how we would like to see the country. I just feel like at this point, he will use any political stance, platform, anyone that, you know, can kind of help him sway or, you know, gather the Black vote for him. He'll take it and he'll agree with it. But because he's someone who with no moral integrity, I can't take, even if he agrees to anything or whatever he says right now, who's to say that if he becomes president, he'll follow through? That is my issue with him.
No, I get that. And I also want to just champion, I don't know if I said it to you, global citizens, but get your ass out there and vote. Right? Your right to vote has been fought for. People have died for many, many years. Frederick Douglass says slavery is not abolished until the Black man has the ballot. Slavery is not abolished until the Black man has the ballot. Now, Frederick Douglass was an enslaved African-American man that escaped his owner in Maryland and went to Massachusetts and became an abolitionist. But I think he understood the fundamentals, right? So those people like Diddy who are out there saying, hold your vote hostage, or I don't want to vote because I don't think it matters. Hundreds of years ago, they understood very clearly that freeing you hypothetically has no effect unless you have laws that protect your rights. And to protect your rights, you have to be involved in doing so. So I say to those who criticize the timing of Ice Cube, at least he did it. Where are all the other programs? I don't think there's any perfect timing that you have that. Say we could have said he could have come together with that at some other point in time or earlier to help out or thought, well, it didn't happen. Right now, he has a clear plan. Right now, even if Trump wins, I think what he's doing is motivating, inspiring, putting in place something that we never had. So say, if I don't care who he talks to, I think the idea, I think it's a bigger plan than just having either Trump or Biden to buy into his plan. I think he had an underlying thought process to motivate African Americans to start fighting for the rights that we're protesting for. I think he was the impetus to start a national plan. I don't know if he thought anything was going to come of it, but I think, you know, why I appreciate and value and fucks with him heavy on this contract with Black Americans is because I think what it does, it opens up the dialogue to have a national plan so that whoever is in power, which is one of the key things he said, that he's looking for them to push forward our agenda if you want our vote. We wanted to hold our vote hostage, but had no idea what we were holding it hostage for. We want to vote Democrat, but what happens after in terms of accountability? One of the great things that Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor in Georgia, said was that, would you let anyone look over your money or appoint them to be in charge of your money and then check on them every 2 or 4 years? Of course not. You want regular updates. So what we don't do is that we vote and we don't hold these people accountable. There's nothing to hold them accountable for. You want to hold your vote hostage, but you have no reason to hold your vote hostage for. So I think Ice Cube's plan, late or whatever, is right on fucking time. He has something he's saying, listen, if you want to get our vote, we're looking for these things to be put in some kind of plan. Now, of course, the way Donald Dumb Trump did, he took that plan and made a platinum plan, which was an offshoot of what Q put together, but Q didn't endorse him. I think Trump, of course, in his idiocy, thought that this is how I can, win the black vote by saying I now have a black national plan. But we all know he's not putting any of those plans into place. The Affordable Care Act is up right now. He's trying to abolish Obamacare with no clear plan to put another health care plan in place, which now I believe the people with pre-existing conditions and people who have, health insurance, all lost, all abolished, because he has no plan to replace. He promised us replace and repeal. He only wants to eliminate anything Obama did. That's some racist bullshit on his side, because he just can't take that Obama did a great job. And as far as the economy, not to get on the Obama train, when Obama got into office in 2009, and please, global citizens, fact check when people tell you that he created the greatest economy ever. The economy was around 14% of unemployment rate, 14 to 10%, something around there when Obama got in 2009 to 10. When he left in 2016, before Trump took office, it was at 5%. So it was already going down. So Trump inherited a great booming economy and fucked it up. And now we're back at 11%. Most African-American jobs and small businesses are completely gone. It can never recover. So I don't understand those that have conservative values, and I want to talk about that too. So I think that African-Americans that are Christian side on what they consider this conservative value piece of it, where, and the conservative values are values that the Republican Party's platform is stabilized in, and that the Democrat has a more liberal value with gay rights and all the other, and they don't agree. So I think we're disjointed at that moral road.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about, because I think this is very important, especially for my generation. Let's talk about the millennial vote, right, and young people, okay, and the importance of voting, because I think a lot of people, young people especially, have lost faith in the system. But I'm one of those people who are of the mind that the system is a system, and like the best way to defeat the system is through the system, because it's there. There's a whole reason why we have a constitution and why it was designed the way it was, right? So what do you say to the young people of America who are on the fence? Because a lot of young people still, now we've seen a huge change and a surgence of people now realizing the value of their vote. But we still have a lot of people who are on the fence that, necessarily, they're sitting at home and they're like, why should I vote? My vote doesn't really matter.
Sure.
What do you say to that?
Well, I say to them that that's bullshit. And I think that's the exact thing that those who are currently in power want you to believe, that your vote doesn't matter, that your vote doesn't count. And that apathy is how they maintain power. So if you want to institute change, young people, Gen Z, millennials, Generation X, and even boomers, I think our mindset has to change. Like, this country is built on us, like we the people. We need to get back to our mantra of we the people, who have control of changing the way the country is. Right now, the establishment, who currently has control, wants you to believe that your vote doesn't count. And because you haven't, they've maintained control for years, and they've had the ability to suppress your vote and your voice. So I believe that, one, that we need to educate ourselves more. We don't know enough about our voting system. It's not every fucking 4 years, guys. That's the presidency. There are votes that happen every 2 years. Your House of Representatives, your Senate. Did you know, guys, that your House of Representatives and your Senate, if controlled by the same party, can effectively neutralize the president? So even if Donald Trump won again, and say Democrats won the House and the Senate, that we could effectively control him. The reason why he's out of control now is because Republicans own the Senate, which we don't pay attention to the Senate races at all. We are now more aware, but previously these politicians that had those areas think that, oh, they're just waiting for the president. So we put all our hope in the president, and the president failed us. So all those that say Trump or Biden's not good and Trump's not good, it's not just the presidency. Where's our plan to have him accountable once we put someone in office after 4 years? That's what I want our younger generation to do. Be more invested in your local government. Remember, the first thing I said when I got on here, we talked about is keep in mind, there's differences between the federal government and the local governments. That you can have federal laws passed, but the local governments put them into play. We should be thinking, how do we make sure our federal government, our president, and the top positions have our best interests in mind? And then let's start electing our governors, our attorney generals, our representatives that represent our districts. Those are our constituents that go to Congress and champion our cause, but we're blind to that. And they are voted into office, pass laws, and we complain and protest. So I'm saying is this. I'm asking the Black Lives Matter, the Color of Change, and all the other groups that are out there that speak to helping African Americans receive more of their rights socially, economically in our country, have a plan. Have the same kind of plan you're asking for our president to have in reference to our healthcare plan. Where's our plan? We're looking for them to rescue us. It's like, where's his African American? No, where's our fucking plan to have him enforce it? Or have them enforce it. That's why I fucks with Cube. He's like, I don't give a shit who's in office. Now we need a plan. So I think he sparked a revolution of conversation and dialogue. And granted, you can't force people into shit. Dialogue is the strongest way in order to find a clear path forward. And we should engage into it exhaustively until we can find resolution.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, that's it from my side. Thank you so much, Pharaoh. I think that was very enlightening and informative. And I just want to honestly, I want to, specifically talk to the young people out there. I think, at some point we forgot a little bit about the history and the government and how it works. But, like the Pharaoh said, there's three branches to the government. There's the legislative, there's the executive, and the judicial. And the president is only one branch, and so let's participate as much as we can in all the branches of government,
Right. Stop putting all our eggs in one basket, right?
Exactly.
The president's not going to rescue you. I'm sorry, global citizens, the president's not going to rescue you. We have to rescue ourselves, right? We have to hold them accountable. We have to vote. We have to take charge. Let's take our fucking country back.
Yes, sir.
Not that I was hollering. Right. Wear your damn mask, people. Wear your mask, right? And please go back and look at our last podcast in terms of vaccines and how to choose the correct vaccine. There's two things I'm asking you guys. That's it. One, to be aware, to be on point in reference to taking this vaccine. Make sure you go back and check how vaccines are approved so that you educate yourself on when to take it. And two, our vote in 9 days. We have 9 days to decide to change the course of our history. We can win, Democrats can win the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and then it's up to us to get together. I'm not trying to say to adopt Cube's plan, but if we don't have any other plan, let's rally around the contract for Black Americans, right? Which are asking for things across the board that every African American can utilize. Absolutely. If not, we'll end up protesting year after year after year after year for the same shit. And that's what they're counting on. For us to protest, make a little noise, and let it die down. And no effective change takes place. But vote that ass out, change the rules, and then watch our lives change in accordance with that. Yeah?
Absolutely. Remember, it's not a fucking moment. It's a fucking movement. It's go.
A movement. It's not a moment. It's a movement, and we need a collective movement. So I'm advocating everyone, get out and vote. Vote on November 3rd. And I say you have two choices only. Don't waste your time going back and forth between, Biden in 1994 voted, right? Understand what that looks like, right? The other choice is 4 more years of a president that has suppressed your rights. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We have economic strife, and there's racial tension. So that choice for me is very clear. Even if we vote Biden and Kamala Harris's ass into office, where is our plan to hold them accountable? You're not off the hook, global citizens, because say we win this election, then I'm still going to be pressing you to make sure some way we have a plan that our interests are taken into consideration and we see actual change. And I'll stop hollering.
All right, Pharaoh. Let's do it. Let's close this. Yep.
So you know how we do when we close out global citizens? Awaken to the
current.
Right, that way, awaken to the current. Or no, awaken to the past.
Awaken to the past. Woke to the current.
I was too high, right? Yeah. So, awaken to the past.
Awaken to the past. Woke to the current. Stay woke for the future. Healthy. Unfuck America.
Vote. Thank you.
Get your booty to the pole, 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 yeah.
Did we get your attention? Good.
So, you really not gonna vote? You know it's more than just the president on the ballot, right? Check it.
A district attorney decides who to prosecute,
including whether or not to go after dirty cops.
Do you know who elects the DA? We do, but you don't want to vote.
Want trades and coding taught in our schools?
Then vote for the school boards that will prepare us for the job market.
Want to end cash bail?
Well, then vote for the sheriffs and county officials that feel the same way you do.
But you talking about, they gonna pick who they gonna pick, shawty.
Black lives don't matter to some of our current elected officials.
If they matter to you, then don't let other people decide who's gonna run your community. Get your booty to the poll. Get your booty to the poll.
Get your booty to the poll.
Get your vote, yeah, vote, stretch.
For information on how and where to vote, as well as resources to find out who's running where you live, go to getyourbootytothepoll.com.
Get your booty to the poll, get your booty to